Over time, film as a medium has tended toward realism for numerous reasons, among which seems to be the presumption of genre fiction as essentially being schlock. This has coincided with an overall cultural shift toward modernist modes of thinking that necessitates magic as a figment of pre-modern, unscientific thinking, meant to be put away alongside the other fancies of childhood. As such, there's the presumption that in such films that do utilize magic, it is necessarily separable from the substance of the characters and theming. We tend to think of magic and the people who believe in it as a primitive replacement for science. That's the sort of people thought that diseases were magical afflictions because they didn't know what germs were sort of thinking. Among other things, I feel that this view is rather reductive, not just to the people of yesteryear, but to the people of today as well. Though the universe is certainly made up of atoms, humans have five senses, and none of them are capable of perceiving atoms. What we are capable of perceiving is stories. And in the stories that we tell ourselves now through film, we limit ourselves by thinking of magic as an explanation. Magic is, I would argue, the defiance of explanation. And perhaps we might find that there is a greater place for magic within the stories that we tell. In a recent dive into the so-called mind game film, Alcazar's point on the subject spoke to me in a particular way. It's an established habit within film analysis and criticism to ignore the form and content as an element fundamentally proximate to a normative and modernist framework. However, Alcazar points out that this fundamentally misunderstands the mind game film. Defined as a film that complements its narrative with a non-normative representation of perception, the category is much less defined by what it is and better defined by what it is not. We might look to examples such as Memento and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and find little similar about the films in terms of narrative genre. One is a neo-noir drama film, while the other is a romance film. But what we find between the two is a defiance of normative framing to better accentuate the mental state of the chief characters. The logic of temporal and physical reality are manipulated so as to frame the characters' perspectives diegetically. Though we're rather preoccupied with the importance of our own perspective as a single and objective arbiter, we are not so rational, and reality is not so forthcoming as to present itself in its absoluteness. These films, were they organized through the normative, invisible style of editing with a normative chronology and a normative shape to their events, would not strike their proper resonance. Memento is told essentially backward, beginning with the resolution and ending with the inciting incident, which centers our experience of Leonard so as to fundamentally match the character's own experience. Within Leonard's own point of view, he's a hero fundamentally bound to the processes of rationality, seeking vengeance for the life of his wife. However, being bound to a bubble of recency, were we to see him from an outside perspective, he would seem very much unlike his own self-construal. He's a victim to manipulation, harnessed as almost a living time bomb, set to murder people at the whims of others. But the experience of this manipulation from a third-person perspective removes his experience from the equation and fundamentally robs the film of its messaging about grief. From a third-person perspective, the realism of his experience would be far too easily dismissed as a flight of madness, detached from our own experience in some essential way. Therefore, the effectiveness of the film within emotional realism is bound to the elements as they are. In the same way, I believe our experience of magic within film as a pre-modern explanation for modern principles fundamentally ignores this same experiential aspect to the messaging of film. Now, I must confess that I did tell a bit of a lie at the outset of this essay. There is a form of magic on film that is commonly accepted as its own dissectable and irreplaceable element, and that is technology. Science fiction, I would argue, is a modern form of storytelling that centers magical realism as a fundamental aspect of its messaging. And here we find a distinction in the typology of magic. Within film, as was helpfully pointed out by Thor in the one good scene of his movie,
Your ancestors called it magic, and you call it science. Well, I come from a place where they're one and the same thing.
Magic is the same thing as technology in movies. If magic is a fundamental defiance of explanation, something that is more coherently explained by its own rules rather than the rules of modernism, then technology is much the same in modern movies. Though this form of magic is generally explained through a pseudoscientific explanation that calls for what experts in the field might call technobabble.
Engineering here. We got a subspace anomaly, a graviton pulse. We got a catastrophic diagnostic cycle result. Inertial dampeners just went offline, and that's a 10-hour job, but we'll do it in 5. I need a cryosensor, hyperspanner, neutrino probe, and a phase compensator for the warp manifolds.
Did any of that make sense? No, it wasn't supposed to. Setting aside the fact that I chose that example specifically for its absurdity, this is essentially the same thing that we would find in any film that tries to explain the mechanics of its fictional science. Though some science fiction authors and filmmakers are more preoccupied with maintaining an aesthetic of scientific realism than others.
Romilly? Hey, you okay?
Yeah.
You alright?
Yeah, I just need a minute.
Okay, I think we have some Dramamine in the hab pot. I'm just gonna go get that.
Oh.
Might be in the cryo bale. Just be a sec.
Hey, Brian,
Yeah.
bring a lot.
The explanation remains pseudoscientific nonetheless. As in the same way, fairy story magic also operates on a set of rules and principles, but it's merely more open about its arbitrarity. Traditionally, the distinction drawn between the two has been a distinction of aesthetics, one of futurism and one of esotericism. Though I do somewhat agree, I feel that it is worth drawing a starker line, as this reveals what I believe is a cynicism that has grown into a fundamental plague within our media. Both can and do exist within even the same piece of media, and there's more to the functioning of magic within narrative fiction than just the coat of paint that's been applied over the green screen. And where else, then, can we possibly look to find this distinction than where the end of all film-related roads lead? The above-average fantasy film series, Star Wars. Within the first film, we find both magic and technology coexisting within the same ecosystem, but we find a fundamental difference between the way that characters interact with and utilize each type for a unique set of narrative utility. Within Star Wars, there are countless pieces of technology that escape our understanding of science. Spaceships ferry our characters from planet to planet, their guns shoot lasers, their swords are blades of energy. However, there also exists a source of mystical magic through the Force.
The Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together.
Technology, though no less a defiance of scientific explanation, is distinguished from mystical magic by how the characters interact with it. Characters are tired and worn down by the magic of technology. In fact, technology quite literally means to crush its fist down on our characters through the Death Star. But the Force is something else entirely. Characters doubt its existence openly.
Kid, I've flown from one side of this galaxy to the other. I've seen a lot of strange stuff, but I've never seen anything to make me believe there's one all-powerful force controlling everything. There's no mystical energy field controls my destiny.
The Force is characterized almost like Prospero in Shakespeare's Tempest, a guiding hand behind the narrative, pushing our heroes past the crushing grip of technology, performing its dramatic spectacles, beholden to none, but ultimately guiding our heroes to their ultimate resolution and triumph. Particularly striking to me here is the way that mystical magic and technological magic are placed into explicit conflict within this film.
Use the Force, Luke. Let go, Luke.
The Force is strong in this one.
In the end, the Force, our mystical magic, utterly destroys the technological terror of the Death Star, our technological magic. This in itself represents to me why Star Wars has since gone on to be one of the longest-running film sagas in existence, and utterly ruined by Disney, those motherfuckers.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Fundamentally, Technological magic is bound by an aesthetic of mundanity, whereas fairy magic is bound by an aesthetic of reverence. That being said, this dichotomy is now defined less by the coat of paint and more by the narrative utility, meaning that we can now define examples that use technology in an inverted match of magical form and coat of paint. Technological magic is a cynical thief, something that robs the world of its mystery by making mundanity of the fantastical. Whereas mystical magic is a reverent renewal of the supposedly mundane to restore the mystery and fantasy. Technological magic makes of our own bodies a mere collection of cells subject to the harsh and unyielding scrutiny of the universe. In Alien, the titular creature is a technological magic that literally turns one's own flesh into a nightmarish creature composed of the parts of ourselves which, in combination, makes for the most dangerous creature in existence. It's a sexual predator bent towards violence and so unkillable so as to rival our own uncanny resilience. It's composed of a carapace, bone, and machinery, and to the cynic, it is the perfect organism.
Its structural perfection is matched only by its hostility.
Coveted as a commodity by the worst among us. Mystical magic takes the trees that we've found so omnipresent in our lives that they lose their value, and it makes of them walking and talking entities so complex as to be people in their own right, as with Treebeard and the Ents in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. This is not to say that technological magic is fundamentally at odds with humanity, while mystical magic is fundamentally at peace with humanity.
I am on nobody's side, because nobody is on my side, little orc.
There are, of course, your radioactive spiders that turn kind-hearted nerds into Spider-Men, as well as talking and moving trees that throw apples at Dorothy. But whether or not technological or mystical magic serves humanity is ultimately irrelevant to the point of mystification or demystification. In the case of the aforementioned wall crawlers, it demystifies the selection of fate, making their mystical powers a matter of happenstance rather than selection for resilience and kindness. And in the case of the apple-throwing trees, nature is reverentially given its own agency with which it might act as it desires. Additionally, we can now define examples which contain inversely aesthetized versions of each type of magic. WALL-E, for instance, is an ostensibly science fiction defined setting, but the magic that puppets the robots and makes characters of them is bound by mystical magics like love rather than technological magics like programming. On the inverse, the Harry Potter series generally makes the technological magic of an aesthetically mystical magic. Though there are instances of mystical magic, such as the setting of Hogwarts Castle itself being an inexplicably magical place, almost possessing of a will of its own through the ways that the staircases and corridors shift, the majority of magic is simply a technological product of utilizing a wand and speaking magical commands, proclaiming Lumos to create a light in the way that we might tell Siri to turn on her flashlight. Remember this, it will come back later. Now, having established this dichotomy, the question naturally arises, why is this important? In my view, this is important to understand as it provides a useful framework through which we might understand a problem of cynicism within the sorts of movies that are allowed to be prestige films. There's a manner to which our modernist-dominated culture tends to endorse cynicism and realism as being, firstly, fundamentally entwined, and secondly, more inherently valuable as commentary. Film has largely trended toward greater realism over time, but in order to properly understand that statement, we need to interrogate the meaning of realism. Looking to Zavattini, his version of realism revolves around his dream to create a 90-minute film of the life of a man to whom nothing happens, according to Bazine's essay on the topic. This philosophical foundation informed many great works of film through Italian neorealism, but the unfortunate side effect of this is the assumption that a 90-minute movie of the life of a man in which nothing happens is the only facet of realism. This reflects a particular view of reality as being cynically uneventful, and though Zavattini and his ilk used that empty space to inform a psychological experience for their characters, the surface association between a sort of uneventful mundanity and realism stuck. Realism has since become the language of prestige, Films wrestle directly with the plagues of their era, involving themselves with a brutalist presentation of harm and strife. Therefore, when mixed with the hyper ideology of Hollywood, which tends to prefer the aesthetic of the fantastical, there presents a problem. How might one resolve the dialectical tension between the desire for spectacle and the desire for realism? To answer this, we must address the fundamental tension between the human experience and realism. As I mentioned previously, there are certainly aspects of reality that exist. Atoms define the literal material of every interaction and every physical interaction, but again, we're incapable of perceiving atoms. Our perception of those atoms, however well informed as it may be, will always fall short of capturing reality in its fundamental absoluteness. Though there's a psychological truth to the bleak ending of De Sica's Bicycle Thieves, it is ultimately ever as fictional as Star Wars or any other more fantastical film. Therefore, by the opposite face of the same coin, there's a psychological truth to the fantastical in such movies. There's a need for surrealism to represent the aspects of reality that escape the realist lens of analysis. Perhaps we might understand poverty and desperation through a modernist lens of materialism, as the desperation brought on by poverty is itself brought on by materialism. It's simple in that way. A modernistic problem of unbalanced mathematical formulae that spawns a brutalist problem that's easily represented by reality. However, how is one to represent something much less materialistic, like depression? Certainly, one can make use of the hallmarks of depression as seen from an exterior view, but in the same way that Leonard looks much different from a straightforward examination of events, this will lack the experiential qualities that the altered temporality of the film allows it to impart. It's a problem of modernism that it fails to account for the much less subjective human experience of reality when it posits that a singular truth is somewhere out there that can be just discovered. This manifests itself within psychology rather often. As a science bent towards modernistically categorizing human experience, it carries with it a weight of objectivity, but can only properly gesture towards solutions to problems that we can't so easily categorize. Biologically, psychology can understand that serotonin creates the experience of happiness through the movement of chemicals and the reactions of concentration gradients. However, on the experiential and treatment aspects, psychology as a science is hopelessly bound between innumerable contradictions. The treatment for depression can include any number of hundreds of combinations of variables, from chemical treatments to social treatments to cognitive training to any number of other ideas, but no two people experiencing depression will respond in the same way to the same treatment. It's telling, therefore, that the best solution we've come up with on that front is to just pair an expert with a patient, then allow that expert to do as they feel is necessary. The only solution to the contradictory elements of depression is to add an element of fallibility who's capable of looking past the atoms and seeing the experience of personhood. Depression, in this way, exists within our world as its own form of magic. It cannot be scientifically categorized in the way that we organize chemicals and forces, which leaves it as magic. It's not something to be explained, it is the defiance of explanation, and can only be represented with a narrative as a defiance of explanation. When an explanation does not exist, a lack of explanation becomes the only coherent explanation. This can therefore take the form of a bend to reverence and mystification, or mundanity and demystification, and each will serve toward particular tendencies. In the revitalization of the mundane into something that is, for lack of a better word, magical, it plays towards a beautiful realization of the parts of life that make life most worth experiencing. Nature, in all its contradictory beauty, can only properly present itself as an experience of magic, and the experience of love is the center point of so much magic, because how else can one hope to codify such a singularly sublime and incoherent mess of contradictions? In our cynicism, we fail to realize that the most ancient form of communication, storytelling, is, at its heart, a reflection of our experiences and desires more than it is about presenting what is real. The utilization of magic as a shorthand for that which lies beyond our limited human perception has been a fundamental part of storytelling for longer than we can comprehend, and still is. However, the modernist lens has dampened our view of this magic. It tells us that in Pirates of the Caribbean, Barbossa was merely clinically depressed and in need of a round of Prozac. He faces all the hallmarks of depression, the anhedonia, the apathy, the guilt.
I feel nothing. Not the wind on my face, nor the spray of the sea, nor the warmth of a woman's flesh.
But there's a fundamental aspect to which so simple a reading loses the reverence for the condition that a magical depiction maintains. There's a feeling to the hollowness of a skeletal visage and the interminable search for absolution that cannot be depicted in a more literal fashion. There's a feeling to the loneliness of Sarah Kerrigan, the Queen of Blades, as she sat and lorded over the ravenous swarms, that speaks to a sentiment of being an isolated outcast even in the presence of billions of other beings. There's a feeling to Miles Morales leaping from the top of a building only to rise into the frame that so gloriously embodies the feeling of finding who you are and can be that would be otherwise understated. And there's a feeling to Frodo tearfully wishing goodbye to his dearest friends with whom he's shared such unmercifully complex ordeals before passing forever into the unknown because that's what he needs to be happy. And that speaks to that sensation of needing to abandon the things that you know and love at the end of the journey like nothing else can. None of it makes logical sense. None of it is real in the literal sense, but there's something real to it that speaks across decades, centuries of human experience better than any faithful recreation of reality ever could. Yet, so powerful and necessary as magic is in these endeavors, our modernist takes almost seem to crave the cold sterility of cynicism. This is the American preoccupation with science fiction. It's the necessary cynicism of technological magic and the pre-traumatic sense of loss that was Hollywood's answer to the need for a modernist magic of mundanity. This is not to say that the cynical lens of technological magic is entirely worthless. In the depiction of trauma and fear at the apathy of an unfeeling universe, nothing rivals technological magic. Alien is one of my favorite movies of all time, with its depiction of a horrific and uncaring entity that reflects a combination of many of our worst tendencies as humans, making the sublime emptiness and hostility of space and sex into a mundane hijacking of our atoms and cells. Yet, in the end, we take that magic and triumph over it. For as hard as anyone in the story may try, Weyland-Yutani can never win out. The alien will never fall into their hands, and it will never dominate the universe because we are not so cynical to believe that the worst parts of ourselves will win out in the end. The mystical magic still reigns supreme in the end because for all of the existential threat that cynicism and technological magic offers, it still cannot win out over the mystical magic that reveres our better qualities.
Mommy! Oh, God.
Not bad for a human.
Films need magic because I'd argue there's no other way to properly portray the magic that is reality. It's terribly easy in an age where we've filled the blank pages of every map and have set to categorizing everything to forget that magic does exist. Love is not merely chemicals that react in your brain. Love is the experience of connection.
Grandpa? Maybe you could come over and read it again to me tomorrow.
As you wish.
When you categorize love into a figment of dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, you lose sight of the reality that people will live, fight, and die for love. It doesn't make sense, it's not logical, and so how could it be anything but magic within our own perception? Yet in our modernist age, we're more apt to treat the fancies of magic as though they're a childish pseudo-realism. Audiences clamor for an explanation of magic that feeds some pseudo-scientific explanation, and that demystification is absolutely everywhere. From just about everything in Harry Potter, whose finale is a deeply anticlimactic argument over wand physics.
It will always pass. I killed Snape. But what if the wand never belonged to Snape? What if its allegiance was always to someone else?
And Star Wars itself, which has since made the Force into, I don't know, midichlorians or something?
I've been wondering, what are midichlorians?
Midichlorians are a microscopic life form that resides within all living cells.
They live inside me.
It breaks what magic is, and it turns the sublime reverence of a universe that we trust to be beautiful and incomprehensible and turns it into a plot device. Harry Potter is a story about a group of outcasts fighting off the fascistic shadow of bullies. Harry spends his entire journey learning how to deal with bullies, starting off from his cousin and an uncle who bully him into the closet under the stairs, continuing on with Snape and Malfoy while he's at school, and ending with the biggest bully of them all, Lord Voldemort. That in mind, who cares what the wooden sticks decided? It'd be like if a sci-fi story ended with the protagonist and antagonist asking Siri who was right and who was wrong.
Harry, I think you should win this one. Voldy didn't do his homework.
The cynicism of technological magic is only worthwhile insofar as it reveals the true forms of mystical magic within our own lives. There are countless movies whose magic is lost in their own cynicism, and in an age like ours, it's so terribly easy to be cynical. So, if nothing else, that's my ultimate point. Not to lose sight of the wonders of the world around us, and not to try so hard to root out the precise mechanics of magic that we demystify the magic out of our own existence.